All right, so this is a little bit of a bait and switch because I was going to talk about the United Order. I'm going to mention it, but as happens very often when you get into a complex subject, you discover that it's a lot deeper than you thought. And the United Order was a very short period where the Mormons tried to run a cooperative economy, have property held in common, produce for everybody's well-being, get rid of money, all these traditionally kind of like socialist things. But that was a very small part of the whole history of the Mormons in Utah. That was only, in some cases it was less than a year. That system lasted less than a year in some places. In other places it lasted longer, into the 1880s, 10 years, 12 years. But I realized that it was too specific of a subject, so I'm going to talk about more of the background today. And maybe, because one of the things I've discovered is that Salt Lake is like the best city to study the United Order, to study the early history of Mormons, obviously, because there's a university right here and we have all the documents. I'm considering going to the church history library and seeing if they let me read anything. I don't know if that's gonna happen because I'm not Mormon, but we can try that out. So maybe further on down the line, I'm saying I'll come back with something about specifically the United Order. But today I just want to talk about just the basic history and the structure of Mormon society for the first 20 or 30 years after they settled in the Salt Lake Valley. And particularly talk about the Mormon relationship to private property and what property relations can really tell us about a society. So there's three themes, I guess, for this talk. There's three ways we can try to understand Mormon society. We can either look at the theology, because this was a pretty much, I don't know, not monocultural community, but one faith, basically. The state and the religion in the early settlement period were unified, right? And so you would think, well, if everybody believes the same thing, if everybody has the same book that they're reading out of, then that would matter somehow for the society. And that's probably what, like, believing Mormons. Do we have any Mormons in here, by the way? Any people who have been Mormons? Okay, all right. So just to put this out there, like I'm not gonna quote like chapter and verse or whatever, but if you hear me say something that's obviously untrue, and you can just correct me, like from your years of indoctrination, I guess. If you can do that, that would help, because I've never been Mormon. I didn't grow up here, so, and I try to stay away from the theology, but I had to read a little bit of it. So actually, my girlfriend she used to be Mormon, and she came in. I was doing research. I had the Doctrine and Covenants up on LDS.org. I was looking at it, and she came in and was like, "What are you reading?" So. And I played it up. I was like, well, Courtney, I've been reading the Doctrine and Covenants. And you know what? This guy's making some good points. So, so that's one source, theology, the book, what Joseph Smith said, what Brigham Young said, what the Book of Mormon tells us about the nature of humans and their relationship to one another and how they relate to nature. That's one source. The other source is the environment of Utah, because there were very unique things about, this is Utah, by the way, there are very unique things about the environment, just like the physical, like mountains and water, all that stuff. There was something about that the Mormons encountered that had an effect on the way that they had to organize their society. And that's kind of like the vulgar Marxist thing, like, or maybe the Jared Diamond thing would be a better way to put it. Like, you can just look at the climate that a society is in, and then you can determine everything about it based on, how hot or cold it is or what grains grow there. So theology is kind of suspect. The environment is also it's not 100% of what we need to look at. We need to consider all three things. And then finally, I think the most important thing about Mormon society is the political decisions that the Mormons made during the course of settling Utah. That, to me, that determines the most about the kind of society that they built. So we're going to talk about all three of them, spend the least amount of time on theology, like I said, because that's my weak point. But we do need to talk about it. So, let's see, how early should we start? So Joseph Smith, for those watching at home, didn't make it to Utah. He dies in 1844. He's lynched. He's in jail. Yeah, he's in jail for something, I forget what, and people busted him in the jail and kill him. So he didn't actually make it to Utah. Brigham Young is the one who comes to Utah and is attempting to interpret the writings of Joseph Smith and set up a society based on his theology in this completely new environment that Joseph Smith never got to see.
He breaks a printing press and then he gets one.
Okay. All right. I knew it was something about, I don't know, because there were tensions between him and that's actually, we're going to talk about that, tensions within the settler community in Utah. That's one of the things they're trying to escape by coming here. So early Mormonism thought that, sort of like early Christianity, and I think early Islam, all of them thought that God's return was imminent. They thought it would be, like the apostles of Jesus thought that Jesus was going to come back, not eventually, not in the far future, but within their lifetimes. And they went around preaching and went to the nations with that in mind, like it's going to happen, you better repent right now. And early Mormonism was like that too. They thought that God was coming back and that this meant something very specific. They had to establish a kingdom on earth, like a political organization that would prepare the earth for his return. And then he would come back, rule for 1,000 years, and then I think everybody goes to heaven after that. Does that sound right? God rules for 1,000 years and then everybody goes to heaven. Does that make sense to the Mormons in the room, or am I pulling that? Okay.
That's Mormons.
Yeah.
You'd be burned.
What?
You'd be burned, reject God's leadership.
Right. Yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure what, I mean, he rules for 1,000 years, but at the end of that, I guess you would go back, I don't know.
Yes. There's all sorts of work that's supposed to be done in 1,000 years.
But it's like...
And then afterwards,
coming from
gets translated.
Okay.
Right. Coming from another standpoint, from Pentecostalism, I guess, growing up, and then into Mormonism, it's kind of weird, but they kind of have a similar thought process on the end of times where it's supposed to be Christ comes back, he reigns for 1,000 years, then the devil breaks free from his struggles at where he is, and then it's the all-out war where everything blanks out at the end.
Sweet. That's so you were Pentecostal and then Mormon. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, that's a good combo.
Yeah, kind of like a 180 on that one.
Yeah, but I think with Christianity, the thing is we need to preach to people. We need to get everybody on board with our mission. With Mormonism, it was more like we need to do that as well, but we also, there's a political kind of, earthly element to this. We need to set up a kingdom that is preparing the earth for the Lord to return. And there was a political, even economic implication to that. So that's what Joseph Smith says, basically. And he also gets several revelations, again, in the Doctrine and Covenants about something called the United Order of Enoch. And again, the theology is not... Oh, you were waving, okay. The theology is not my strong suit, but it's... The thing is, God's coming back. He's coming to reclaim the earth that he created. All of us are just kind of stewards in the meantime. And therefore, this kingdom of God that we should build on earth should recognize that. God owns everything. We're just taking care of it. So for one man to set up his dominion over other men and own a piece of land and rent it out or run a factory for his own personal benefit, that is not in keeping with the vision that God has for humanity. Because again, the earth, all the resources in the ground, all that belongs to God. So for one man to take that over is not right. And this was attached to another Mormon political idea called theodemocracy, which is that God owns everything, God is sovereign, but the people are also sovereign. So we need to balance these two things somehow. And in practice, it's sort of like you're free under theodemocracy to vote however you want to vote. You have all kinds of freedom. You can do whatever you want as long as God agrees with it. And God, of course, is only present on earth through a very distinct hierarchy of extremely earthly people who are priests, right? So it's sort of it's a weird thing where God owns everything, right? No man can have any dominion over any other man. No man can, monopolize or take over a piece of the commons, you might say, that God owns. But the will of God is expressed through a priesthood that's made up of ordinary people. So there's this constant tension. And that starts with Joseph Smith, but he didn't, there were some kind of abortive attempts at setting up a united order, but it didn't really go that far, again, because Joseph Smith was killed. And the Mormons were constantly moving throughout the country, and Utah is the last place they ended up. So that idea, the kingdom of God, and their attitude towards private property influenced them when they came to Utah. So that's sort of the theology, like God owns everything. We're just here to kind of take care of it. The next major thing that the Mormons encountered when they came to Utah was the fact that I think for the first time in the settlement of the United States, new settlers came into an area and they couldn't do what's called dry land farming. They couldn't just rely on the rain to come down and just water everybody's fields. They had to, from the very beginning, from the day, like when the Pilgrims, arrive in Massachusetts, it's very wet there. Everybody can kind of set up their own little parcel of land, and they have to clear it. They have to get rid of rocks and trees, but eventually, like, everybody's farms are kind of self-sustaining. You don't need to pour fertilizer on them. You don't need to bring water to them. The Mormons faced a very different, so in other words, it promotes individualism to some extent, because each little farm can be isolated from the other, and they have to rely on each other. Like, you need a blacksmith, you need horses, stuff like that. But there wasn't this immediate, right off the bat, need for large infrastructure projects just to get like basic farming going. And Mormons, when they come into the Salt Lake Valley, discover that there's a lot of water here. There's, the greatest snow on earth falling in the mountains, and there's snowpack and that melts, and so there is water that's coming through the valley, but it has to be very carefully controlled. And we have to, the first area that was dammed was City Creek, which is underground now, I think, for most of it. But they come in the summer of '47, and they have to set up irrigation works using this small creek just in order to like water their crops at all, because we get like 15 inches of rain or something here, and you just can't rely on that. So that was the other thing that they encountered in their environment. There was a need from the beginning for large projects, mobilizing large amounts of people to like build things that would be used by everybody. Because if you think about like the Pilgrim example, everybody can be an asshole and have their own farm and just like hate each other and interact as little as possible, but you can't really do that. You have to be, if you have irrigation works, you have to let the water go by to the next dude. You have to take just your allotted amount of water and use that to water your crops, and then you have to let the water go down to the next guy. And not only that, but you have to contribute labor to make sure that the irrigation works stay like operable, and that all the dams that they had to set up to make sure that all that's still working. That requires a lot of upkeep. So there's times when you're working on, a canal or a dam or something like that that's miles away from your farm, and you have to not complain about it, basically. You have to do that, because the next summer when your area of the irrigation works is up for, repair, like everybody else from the valley is going to come over and help you. So there was a need like built into the environment for like communal work and like caring about your neighbor, and not just sitting in your farm and being concerned about your own little area. You couldn't do that. But then again, that interacts with the theology, because according to Mormon doctrine, no man can like set up himself as Lord over other men. No man can just take all the land and then force everybody to work for him. And that was reflected in kind of a sketch that Joseph Smith made called the Plat of Zion, which is right here. Basically, it's like an urban planning document, and all these are little lots, maybe like 5 or 10 acres. And this is how Salt Lake City was initially settled. Everybody it wasn't just go out and get whatever you want. They literally drew lines, on a piece of paper and said, okay, this is what we have. This is, the hill. This is City Creek. I guess it should be from the top, but whatever. And we're going to draw lots. And you're going to take your lot. You're going to take your 5 or 10 acres, and that's your land. That's what you get. And everybody gets the same size land, regardless of how big your family is. If we have surplus, if somebody needs some food, we're going to give it to them. But we're not going to have private land speculation. We're not going to have just like claim jumping. We're not going to have any of that. And actually, there's a few times during the early settlement of Salt Lake when there were like lynch mobs, basically, that were directed at certain people who were suspected of, or not suspected, who were squatting on somebody else's land that had been divinely apportioned. And that's one of the only, for the first 10 years of Salt Lake, the only people who got murdered were people who were squatting on somebody else's land. And it wasn't like there's maybe 5 or 10 people that this happened to, but there was one particular instance, I think near where the fairgrounds are now, where some family had set up a shack on somebody else's land, and there was this, it like went all the way up. It was like one of these, it almost like split the Mormon leadership apart in the community. People literally got a lynch mob together, went down and like killed 3 people who were squatting. So this was like, and that, again, that's in the context of people who had been persecuted. The Mormons were driven out of like each place that they settled in. Now they're in Utah. Finally they have land, and then, there's all these problems with like just dividing land up. So that was that's maybe getting into the politics a little bit. Everybody in Utah wanted land desperately wanted as much land as they could have, but they recognized that in order for that to work, like they had to all work together. Because if people were going against each other, if people were forming lynch mobs, basically, and evicting squatters, and if there wasn't like a rigid boundary, like this is yours and don't fight, like if there wasn't that, then the settler community would have collapsed fairly early on. And so that's my main, I guess the main point I want to make with this lecture, like the communal aspect of the early Mormon settlements. It wasn't like socialism necessarily. It wasn't people really trying to, nationalize the means of production. Not that they could have used those words in 1847 because the Communist Manifesto hadn't been written yet. But I think if you look at the politics of what was going on and the possible conflicts that could have emerged in settler society, having a rigid separation, and saying, well, you get this much, nobody gets more than anybody else, there's no room for jealousy, there's no room for violence. That's a great way to maintain the unity of the whole class of settlers in Utah. So I think I've gotten through that and the other thing. All right, so there's something else. The church has talked a lot about the United Order in this period of history, and obviously now the church is very careful to avoid any reference whatsoever to communalism or socialism or communism. They say that for the Mormons to share things with each other and not have private property, it just was, I forget even the words that they use. They make a legal argument. They say that the United Order was all about confirming private property because each man owned his own plot and consecrated his surplus to the bishop's storehouse or something like that. And it was all kept track of, and everything was, this is your land, this is your food, we're taking it from you and giving it to somebody else, but it's still yours, that sort of thing. So they try to weasel their way out of it a little bit. And there are modern day defenders of the United Order who say that, well, actually that's garbage, you can look at the laws, but what really mattered is the way that the Mormons treated each other. They were, pooling the resources together. They were sharing without regard to profit. They had private land ownership, they had titles and stuff, but it wasn't manipulated in the same way that happens under capitalism. Actually, there was a guy who tried to set up kind of a landlord system like in present-day Sugar House. He got way more acreage, somehow just went out and staked it out, way more acreage than he had been allotted, and other people started moving in on his claims, and he went to the bishop and said, this is garbage. And the bishop said, actually, what you're doing is causing the division. So you need to just take the land that you were given, right? Take the land that is enough for your family, and we're going to take the rest of your land and break it up and give it to these other families officially, right? So according to the church today, that's a defense of private property because everybody eventually got their own little block of land. But I think it makes more sense to look at that as actually, going against private property. But there was one thing that the people who attack the United Order in the church and the people who defend it, there's one thing that they have in common, and that's that they only focus on the internal relationships, like within just Mormon society. They talk about the way that poor Mormons would relate to rich Mormons, and they talk about the way that the church would relate, like the hierarchy would relate to just common believers. What a lot of people ignore, which I don't totally understand, is the fact that the Mormons moved into, this is Salt Lake, and this area was not occupied, I can't remember, I read a book about this a while ago, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Salt Lake Valley was not occupied by any native tribes when the Mormons showed up. I think it was mainly to the northwest and to the south, like the immediate south, like Utah Valley was completely tribal land, there were settlements everywhere. And I think tribes would move through the Salt Lake Valley, but it wasn't owned by any particular tribe at that point. So there was no like immediate ethnic cleansing when the Mormons showed up. Very quickly though, most of the land in Salt Lake Valley was claimed. Mormons started to move into Utah Valley, and then later on, obviously they get all the way down to St. George and over into Nevada and up into Idaho. And all of that, pretty much all of that was land that was used by tribes, by people who were not Mormon. And the Mormons took the land when the natives happened to be out, or actually attacked native settlements and forced them to leave. And when natives came by demanding, like asking for rent payments, like, well, it's fine that you took this pasture, that's okay, but now that we don't have any access to it anymore, can we have some of your cattle that you're now raising on the land that we used to own? This is what happened in Utah Valley. I think it was a Paiute tribe. Again, I read this book a while ago, I've completely forgotten. They were using, it was apparently great grazing land out there, and they had a lot of horses and cattle that they were pasturing, and the Mormons moved in during the seasonal rotation when the natives would be somewhere else, and then when the natives returned, they realized that their land had basically been taken, and their first response was not to attack the Mormons, but to go up and say, well, I mean, you've kind of overstepped your bounds. We were fine with you living in the Salt Lake Valley. We actually wanted you to live in the Salt Lake Valley because we've been wanting to trade with a white settlement, because you guys have great things like metal implements and horses and guns that we would, love to trade with you to get. But you're pushing on us a little bit too hard here. Like we used to use this land. This is important land to us. Can we, we're not asking you to leave. We just would like you to share, right? Sort of like the way that the surplus within the Mormon community would be socially kind of taken into the bishop's storehouse and shared out. We want you to share with us this time. We want you to share some of the cattle that you're grazing on the land that you took from us. And the Mormon response was to view that as a, provocation and to refuse to offer them anything at all. And then after that, again, instead of attacking settlers, the natives just said, well, if you're not going to give us the cattle, we're just going to take it. We're not going to take all of it. We're going to take what we think is fair. And they did that, and the Mormons caught them doing that and killed them. And then there was a war. The Walker War was the first conflict, I think, between natives and Mormons, and that was around Provo, Lehigh, that area. It ended with the total destruction of the band. There was massacres of women and children. And it was back and forth. I mean, nobody, there was brutality on both sides, but it's sort of like the both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Like the natives were eager to trade with Mormons, eager to have white people living near them for, the economic benefits. Because they'd heard about the Spanish. They'd heard about, the Spanish Empire and all the great things that the Spaniards had. And when the Dominguez Escalante expedition came through in 1776, they came by Utah Lake, and the natives said, can you guys please establish a mission here? So they were not against, reasonable settlement with people who would accommodate their needs and understand it, but the Mormons were not those people, and it took the natives a while to realize that, and by the time they realized it, it was too late. And that's one thing that I think is kind of important to talk about, because I think that throws the whole United Order thing, the internal organization of the Mormon society, it puts that in a different light, because if it was really socialism, then, or if it was, state capitalism, or I didn't even talk about this, Asiatic despotism. I won't talk, that's another 40-minute discussion I don't want to have. But if it was really about sharing the wealth, then why wasn't the wealth shared with the people who were living in, Utah Valley, living in northwestern Shoshone, living in Skull Valley and where Tooele is now? Why wasn't it shared with those people? Why weren't they considered, in other words, the rich and the poor in the Mormon community were going to treat each other with civility and share everything, but outside of the community they were going to direct totally unreasonable levels of violence against people who were coming to them and asking for a fairly restricted, I mean, you think about it, if somebody steals your land, what's your first thought? Well, we're gonna go kill them or whatever. The natives' thought wasn't that. It was well, they have needs, we have needs, let's see if we can come to some sort of agreement here and set up a payment in kind so that nobody's hurt too much. That was the reaction, and it seems fairly reasonable. And the Mormon reaction to that was to completely stonewall them and cut them off. So in the context of the Mormon need to expand out of the Salt Lake Valley and all over Utah, the United Order can actually be seen as a way of maintaining the unity of that community for its particular purpose. So it's sort of like a tactic, like a short-term tactic. We're under threat right now. It's pretty hard to farm. The natives have all the land. They're more numerous than us. They know the land better than we do. Let's kind of let's kind of try to solve as many of our differences internally as we can so that we're not fighting each other, right? So we're not going against each other and bickering over whose farm, where somebody's farm begins and where somebody else's farm ends. Let's stay together so that we can get what we really want, which is all of Utah. And it wasn't even all of Utah. The original state of Deseret that, like the boundaries of that state that Brigham Young submitted to whoever the president was at the time, I forget. The boundaries, this is supposed to be like Nevada, I guess. It included parts of southern Idaho, all of Nevada, California. It went all the way to like San Diego. So that's the state that Brigham Young wanted to begin with, basically the whole Great Basin plus like a blue water port in San Diego. And he didn't get that. They got like Nevada and Utah. But that was the Mormon ambition. It wasn't, they were never going to live in harmony with any of the people who were already living in these areas. They were always going to take over as much as they could. And in that context, the United Order, to me, looks like kind of a short-term concession by one part of the Mormon community to the other. Like, stay with us on this. Don't fight amongst yourselves. Let's stay together so we can, do what we're here to do. Which is funny because the Mormons actually had gotten into trouble back when they lived back east for being too nice to natives. Like, the federal government would set up kind of strict barriers between settlers and natives. You can't trade with each other. The natives can only trade with the government, get our shitty prices. And the Mormons went around that trade ban several times to like trade lumber and I think fur and other stuff like that with Native Americans. And they got in trouble with the federal agent who was in charge of whatever agency the natives were around, because they were like, you can't do this, you're fraternizing with the natives. And that happened in Nauvoo or Ohio or something like that. But again, when the political situation changes, the attitude of the Mormons towards native inhabitants changes drastically as well. And they were, And the other thing, I forgot to mention this, the theology, that's another thing to talk about with Native Americans. Native Americans are a lost tribe of Israel, right, according to Mormonism? Is that correct?
Asterisk.
What?
Asterisk.
Asterisk? What's the asterisk?
They were all turned brown because they're evil.
Well, it wasn't that, it was like a lesser degree of evil, right? Wasn't it?
Not as evil as black people.
Right, not as evil as black people.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that. I mean,
But yes, there were two good brothers who were white Jews, and there were two bad brothers who were also white Jews.
Okay.
And according to Mormon theology, they landed in the Americas, set up a huge civilization. God cursed the two the two bad brothers with dark skin, dark and loathsome skin.
Dark and loathsome, yeah.
And then they were eternally cursed, as were all their progeny. And then eventually they killed all the white people. And that's why there's only brown people left.
Okay.
That's the Spark Notes.
Okay, sweet.
History.
I knew there was something about like, and Jesus was here for the 3 days between his death and resurrection. That was so there's a connection in Mormon theology to Native Americans, and later on they would send missionaries. Before they would, the church was officially racist until the 1970s, but they would send missionaries trying to convert natives like very early on, like in the 1870s, 1880s. And Polynesians, I've never understood the status of Polynesians. Does anybody know that? Because they had the priesthood in like the 1880s, just like everybody else, but I've never heard anything about like where there were two other Polynesian, and they were cursed with like slightly different brown toned skin.
There's nothing official now. There was a book by Bruce R. McConkie, which was doctrine, despite what Mormons say.
Yeah, okay.
Which says that we would know the color and race of all men if we knew their real histories and their wicked deeds that caused them to be cursed.
Okay.
Yeah, second edition.
Sweet.
Yep.
McConkie also claimed missionary effort towards Native Americans was turning their skin lighter.
Okay.
What?
When was McConkie writing?
Oh, he was. This was
like the 1980s.
The 70s.
The 70s. Okay.
But if you go to most Mormon households, you can. People who converted to Mormonism after the 90s probably don't have it.
Right.
But anyone who was Mormon in the 80s has the second edition of Bruce R. McConkie's Mormon Doctrine, which you can look up the black race, and it has all this stuff in it.
Wow. That's pretty incredible. But anyway, at least in the Mormon theology, like Native Americans were more exalted than other races, and they had a special place in history. Like you can go, I know the LDS cruise lady, you can go there and get trips to Mexico to see like Chichen Itza, and that's like Mormons think of that as part of their history. Like which is amazing. But it's also like they say like, oh, the people who built this, and the people who are still living around the pyramids today, like the people who built this are like, they're descended of Israel, like they're God's people too, or something like that. So again, just reading the book, you would think, okay, well, it makes sense that Mormons and natives would get along, because maybe it makes sense that Mormons and black people wouldn't get along. From the book, I can tell that that's not going to go very well. But it seems like natives and Mormons could probably find some common ground, and because the Mormons have respect, and that was completely wiped out. The Mormons acted in a completely ordinary, regular way towards the natives, the same as the Pequots were treated by the Puritans. So, let's see.
You mentioned the Polynesians earlier. There's a fairly common Mormon speculation that like Hawaiians and Polynesians are remnants of the Nephites who sailed away.
Oh, okay.
Because there's a little story in the Book of Mormon about someone who left on a ship.
Okay.
Don't really mention why.
All right. I've always wondered about that.
Because the Lamanite brothers, which are like the Mexicans/Native Americans, were so evil that they got on a ship and sailed away.
Stupid submarine, just for the record.
A submarine?
That was like
Brother Jared.
Brother Jared came to the...
All right, whatever. It's all.
There are wooden submarines and they are silly and implausible. But let's move on from this conversation.
So I guess that was mainly it. I did want to mention that, kind of bring it all back, like connecting to today. There's all kinds of problems, like you've heard about these ATV people who want their state highway that's like not even a dirt path, like the bottom of a ravine. They want declared a state highway so they can use their ATVs on it instead of getting fined. And a county commissioner has like called this protest, and he's getting charged by the FBI or something like that. And obviously all of us heard of Bundy. Bunkerville, Nevada is where Bundy lives. Bunkerville, Nevada was one of the last places in all of like the Mormon country to get rid of its United Order. The United Order lasted longer in Bundy's hometown than it lasted in almost anywhere else. And I thought that was an interesting kind of way to bring it back, because Bundy, the specific things that he said, everybody focuses on like his blatant racism and his like cartoonish understanding of the law. But another thing that he says is that God owns this land. The federal government doesn't own this land. God owns it. So no man has any right to tell me what to do or not to do on this land. It's mine. I'm taking care of it. I'm the steward of it. And that's why I haven't paid the government the $20,000 they've been owed for the last 20, 25 odd years, because this land is owned by God. And that kind of ties directly into the original like preaching of Joseph Smith, to a very like perverted, like crazy degree, because he accepts all kinds of federal money, I'm sure, for his crops, and he's relied on the government in a number of different ways. But it's just when his interests are at stake with this land issue, he pulls out the 19th century theology. So anyway, that was just kind of to bring it back home. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that, particularly from the Mormons, whose history and like basic vocabulary I probably butchered?
So this doesn't come from a religion, but something I think is much better. So Karl Marx writes about primitive accumulation, right? He writes about this in Capital. And when we talk about primitive accumulation, what we're saying is, like, initially there's not enough money in the system. There's not enough goods, services, factories, farms, pastures. It's not concentrated enough. It's too diffuse to kickstart capitalism, right? Because in order to have capitalism, you have to have capital. So he says that there's this primitive in the sense of like first accumulation. And he talks about how there's slavery, there's the extermination of American Indians, there's the exploitation of their resources, right? In the most like egregious, non-quote-unquote capitalist ways. Like if you think about how markets in theory are supposed to work, they're like the exact opposite of it. right, in a highly exploitative way. But then you gather enough capital together, right, that then suddenly you can start instituting markets. You can start instituting capitalism because it's concentrated enough. My thesis is, and it seems like it corresponds to a lot of what you said, is the United Order, rather than a proto-socialism or a Christian socialism, was political, and it was an attempt at primitive accumulation. Sure, the Mormons, rich and poor Mormons treated each other pretty well, but not everything got divvied out of the bishop's storehouse.
Right.
Right. Plenty of money went into the church under the stewardship of the church leaders, who then, when Utah became a territory, then suddenly those leaders were declared to have private property in correspondence with the rest of the country,
right.
Not in a one-for-one basis. So how do you sort of view it as not just like even a temporary political tactic of settlerism, of uniting the settlers against the external, but like as a political economic structure of primitive accumulation to build the necessary resources, the necessary surplus, the necessary infrastructure, and then to institute, quite by fiat, quite just like, surprise motherfuckers, this is what we're doing, capitalism.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, one thing I didn't really mention is that the United Order was the most popular after the crisis of 1873, which was like the huge depression in the 19th century. And it lasted for like 20 years or something crazy like that. And there was Brigham City, which, right up here, was the first place to have they didn't have a United Order, they had like a cooperative. Almost everybody in the town worked in cooperative enterprises, and there was a bank that was owned by the people or whatever, and they had like communal dining halls and communal laundries and stuff like that. And then that was before the crisis, and then when the crisis hit, Brigham Young traveled to Brigham City and saw that they had insulated themselves basically from the rest of the country. They were not affected by the collapse in credit. They weren't affected by railroads going bankrupt or whatever, because they made everything that they needed right there. So, and then he extended that concept first to St. George and then to a bunch of other places. And it worked best in the places that were the most isolated and in the places where people were the poorest, like beforehand. So I think it's sort of, you could look at it as primitive accumulation and a tactic, and also like, sort of like war communism is another thing that popped into my head. Like, oh, everything's fucked, like we can't do normal capitalism. We need to sit down and sort of accumulate and be very, very frugal for a little bit and share as much as we possibly can and not tolerate any of the vagaries of the market or whatever. We have to suppress that for a little time. Not forever, obviously, but just for long enough to get us through our, the economic downturn that we're experiencing. So that was part of it too. Like the Saints wanted to have their own culture. They wanted to have their own country, their own kingdom. And not importing anything was a big deal. They did what I think you would call today import substitution. Like they built, instead of importing soap, they built a soap factory. Instead of like, it even worked with labor too. They built all the railroads in Utah for the railroad companies because they were afraid of the railroad companies just building a railroad and inviting all these Gentiles to come and work on it. They were like, well, we'll do it for really cheap, and we'll gain the expertise of like how do you run a railroad. And by the way, we're going to keep all these non-Mormons out so we can control as much as we possibly can. So, but yeah, to respond to the primitive accumulation, I agree with that. I think, there's like correspondence between how little capital they had and how high the fervor was for the United Order. And then when things got better in the 1890s, people started making fun of, like the tattered clothes and the weird communal aspect of some of these United Order colonies. Like you were supposed to be more independent, and you were not supposed to rely on the community as much. But that came back into vogue after the economy picked up. So
maybe just to circle back to some of the things that Greg was saying, is there seemed to be very similar organization with the Mayflower Compact. So the Mayflower Compact was run as a corporation, and even though all those people worked communally, it was in the ultimate benefit of their end of their own private benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So like they actually did set up like really big long houses. Half the people died either on the, so when the Mayflower and the speedboat came over, like almost half the people died between the travel and like I think the first year, like half the people had actually died. And so these people are like in desperation. And the way that contemporary scholars or contemporary cranks from both sides try to push it is on one side, it's like, oh, look at socialism. The Pilgrims had socialism at the beginning. And then the other one is like, it was an abysmal failure and stuff like this, a socialist experiment. Well, it was never like that. It's like, what if everybody in Halliburton lived on the same campus and started sharing things? You know, it would still be Halliburton.
Right.
And everybody would still be earning a salary in the end so they could do their own thing.
Yeah.
You know, which is also in a certain sense a corporation. So maybe it's helpful to view, and I don't know if this is the truth, but maybe it's sometimes helpful as an exercise to view it more like a corporation in the old sense.
Right.
A corporation.
Yeah, and there was a lot of, this wasn't the only cooperative that sprung up in the US. There was a whole kind of cooperative movement in the 19th century. One of the biggest ones was the Oneida Cooperative, which, anybody ever have Oneida silverware? My mom had a lot of Oneida silverware. They now are like, they don't even produce anything in the US anymore, but they started out as a cooperative, everybody living in the same village, you know, making things for each other. They built all these firms to do everything so they wouldn't have to trade with the outside. The most successful firm turned out to be the one that produced silverware. And then this communal community just turned into a corporation and then ran factories for like, you know, 180 years or something like that in the US, just making profit, you know, hand over fist. And then just recently they sent all of it to China. So it's a good thing I think to compare these kind of communities to just a corporation, because a lot of times that's exactly what they became, just, you know, when the moment things picked up. So, but of course people do use this to complain that socialism worked. Like, well, I think in this case, socialism or like state-directed development and like kind of controlling property laws and like making sure that nobody's, you know, fighting each other over getting screwed over in the market. It did work, and the proof of that is that the Mormons were able to move out and take over as much of the land as they wanted. That's kind of like the success of the Mormons is proof that you know, people working together can do much more than they can when they're competing against each other. So of course, unfortunately, they decided to, you know, take their collective strength and do something horrendous. But it's, you know, it's clear that if they really had wanted to like build a utopia, build the kingdom of God, they could have done it. So. Oh.
Time for questions? Are you raising your hand?
Yeah. I grew up in Salt Lake in kind of a pre-LDS family, my extended family at least. And I've talked to quite a few people that identify as like Mormon socialists that have either like read some Marx and are still socialists and have found a way to like reconcile the two, or people who honestly like read the Doctrine and Covenants or whatever and interpret it as kind of socialistic writings that like when God does come down with his 1,000 years, like pretty quickly, no matter how much people want to hold on to the private property, like it's gonna go socialist pretty quick. Like they just don't see it happening any other way, or you know, whether they're being idealistic in that fashion or not. And I was wondering kind of what you thought of that. Do you think, from what you've read in the Theology, do you think it supports socialism? Can it be reconciled? Can you maybe see why, like?
Yeah, I can definitely see why.
Or maybe why they went competitive so quickly after, after this whole primitive accumulation argument. I'm definitely feeling that, but I was wondering if you had a different read on it too.
Well, from the very like limited amount that I've read about the Doctrine and Covenants and the way that the church presidents have like defended the United Order, it does make sense that just from reading the book that you would come to that conclusion. I think you could come to a number of different conclusions too. I think it's sort of like, people have done that with Islam too. There's Muslim socialists who have gone into the book and said, well, you know, the second message of Islam is that we're all, you know, we don't have the right to exploit each other and oppress each other, and we're, you know, there's this Sudanese guy who said that during the Cold War, he said that Islam is socialist and democratic. When we thought that the Soviet Union and the democracies were like fighting, he said Islam has the best of both of these worlds. You know, so there's people in all kinds of different traditions that have, you know, because I think it's kind of the Doctrine and Covenants are kind of contradictory. Like if I were to read, from what little reading I've done of like all the different like religious texts, I think Mormonism is kind of like the least amenable to some sort of like non-hierarchical like socialist society, because it prescribes like you have to have a hierarchy, right? It says you need presidents, you need like people to interpret the laws, and like they're the authority. I don't know, but clearly people take from the pronouncements about the United Order, they take something different from that, and I can't really say anything about that. Like I agree with them in that you can make that interpretation. I just think that what actually happened like in Utah was not a example of socialism that like we should follow. And I guess that's kind of the whole point of studying something like this, because we have a lot of, like across the political spectrum, as limited as that is in Utah, everybody talks about the pioneers, like, and how great the pioneers were, and how we need to like go back to like what the pioneers did. Like Stan Penfold, who's my city councilman, and he's gay. He wrote a letter into the parade organizers like last year and said, well, I'd love to come join the parade. Can my partner and I show up and get on a float? And they said no. Like the parade organizers were like, no, you can't do that. And so he wrote this great letter back, like, well, as long as you don't recognize me and my right to be with the person that I love, then I don't. He said something like, I don't think that's what the pioneers were really about, or whatever. And there was this kind of attempt to like outdo the parade organizers and the conservatives at their own game by trying to reclaim like the pioneer figure as like a progressive figure, and I think that's completely wrong, I guess, for these reasons. I think that if there's anything like the theology is probably the best part of the United Order, like the words and like what like the kingdom of God or whatever. That's probably the best part of it. I think if we're going to reclaim anything, it should be what these Mormon socialists are reclaiming. But I don't think that should be attached to the pioneer society, I guess, is all I'm saying. So is that okay? It's like 4 people.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know, I was just judging.
So as an oppressed nationality who was born and raised in Utah and has had to deal with this shit for 30 years, I cannot agree with you more that we should not reclaim the pioneer spirit. One thing that I find difficult though is it seems, at least given your presentation, like there's this sharp turn. Right? It's the sharp turn of like, oh yeah, we're doing things cooperatively, communally, and then things pick up. And I mean, even with the primitive accumulation thesis, right, the way that you talk about it, it seems to be like, okay, now we have enough capital, we're going to make this sharp turn, towards capitalism, towards, just modern markets and whatnot. But I mean, there's a really important part about socialism, right? Which is it's not just the means of production, or even who on paper owns them.
Right, yeah.
It's about the social relations, which is to say who can dispose of them, right? And in the case of the United Order, right, what were the biggest fights they had over? Bishop is like, yeah, we're taking your shit. And they're like, you can't take my shit. And the bishop's like, I'm the bishop, you're doing the United Order, yes I can. And the same thing with the stake president, and the same thing up and up and up to the prophet of the church, who was like, hey, yeah, your farm might not be doing too well. Also, you're going to go build this giant granite building because I'm the prophet, and you live here, and I'm telling you to do so. Right? And so I think if you scratch the surface of this socialist, quote-unquote, political economy, you at best get proto-capitalism, if not like semi-feudal relations.
Or that.
Well, I find problematic aspects.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's interesting to do. But anyway. Go ahead.
But here's the thing, right? Is the managers of the funds of capital, I mean, what did they use their funds for? Oh, they went to go set up cooperatives. Well, how's that fundamentally different from a business expanding their franchise? And if we do view Germany and France as capitalist countries, which I do, they have nationalized industries, right? Which
right.
Is the social relations are still determined by the capitalists as a class. Mm-hmm. And so if you look, in my view, if you look at the political economy of Utah, you had them concretely determining all the social relations of production, and then explicitly determining the social relations of production. And now you have the church as a nonprofit, which is actually the smallest part of the church.
Right.
Right? Now the church owns Bonneville Communications, right, the largest telecom or media communications company, Monopoly in Utah, right? There's Monopoly Capital that can dump, what, $2 billion in City Creek as a retail development. All under the auspices of the divine providence of the church, but now just realizing what was always the case, which was the market social relations. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. These things like state capitalism or pro-capitalism, whatever, like the who owns stuff and who directs stuff, that's always kind of sort of like a tool, and it's important to look at who's actually using the tool and what their goal is. Like Mao admitted, and Lenin too, they said what we're building is state capitalism, or in the case of the new economic period, like capitalism is won for a brief period. Like we're using capitalism to build up, our economy so that we can eventually get to socialism. And nobody would look at Maoist China and the United Order and say, well, these are the same things, even though they were, the state owned everything and the state was directing things. It was important, it was critical to make the distinction that in the United Order there was a church hierarchy that was directing everything, who had their own interests. And in China there was obviously a party that had the interest of workers, and they were trying to build a completely different society, and they were using what you could call state capitalist means. They were using state, directed development, whatever, to get to that place, but they had a totally different aim in mind, and they were controlled by totally different people, and that made a real difference in the way that society developed. So
the United Order does not in any way orient itself towards a cultural revolution,
right,
or anything like that.
Exactly. And there's actually one thing I was going to mention but couldn't really fit into any place. There's the St. George United Order Constitution talks about the conflict between labor and capital. It says, well, we recognize that there's a conflict between labor and capital. Therefore, we've set up this system so that they don't have to fight anymore, so that everything is just, it doesn't say like, we recognize that there's a conflict between labor and capital, and labor is a source of all wealth and is right, so capital must be, destroyed or what. It doesn't say that. It says like, there's too much strife. The community is being divided by these, employers against workers, and farmers against tenants, and the rich against the poor. What we really want is just everybody to come together and, kumbaya or whatever.
This is a cheap argument for corporatism as well.
Right. So, and again, and the community that was directed at obviously didn't include any of the native groups in St. George. It didn't include any of the Navajo. So that's the other thing. Like, we're talking about how nice people are to each other, but it's important to remember.
Just to piggyback a little bit on what Greg was pointing out, the social relationships, even though some of them haven't been formally capitalized, have to, in a certain sense, be a reproductive part of that particular social order. Like even the church now, and even more so back then, utilizes a whole lot of just like uncapitalized labor that's necessary to reproduce that system. So like, say for instance, the Relief Society, which is something that's completely taken out of the economic system, but is totally reinforced by the social system itself as necessary.
Right.
And when you were speaking about, like, say for instance, all the corporations and stuff they own, a lot of those, the reason that they can be very successful is, for instance, they get lots of free labor.
Right, exactly.
From the people that's like completely non-taxed and
yeah.
like this. And when people do actually make that economic analysis, I think there was that article when Mitt Romney was running about like something about the church and the way they actually did the finances of it and like how it completely exacerbates the situation, but the actual social order itself, due to the political underpinnings, actually hides the social exploitation because those things don't enter into a strict market exchange.
Right, yeah.
I mean, and that's like in a certain way, like what he was talking about, it's like, well, I know you're gonna die or whatever, or your family's gonna starve, but the order will take care of you, but also I really need you and everybody else to move out to this area and forcibly build this quarry with us.
Yeah.
That's an invisible part of the relations of domination.
Right.
And just as a personal note, so there was a load-in, which for stagehands is where you set something up at one of the church buildings. And so there was the union. They had to hire some union people because it's A, part of the contract, and B, part of, like having things not fall and kill people because we actually know what we're doing. And when they got there, there was over 100 volunteers, including like 7-year-old kids
Yeah.
who were like lifting truss and like carrying lights and doing stuff. So, I mean, this kind of just speaks to the point. It's not like some abstract thing of like, oh, they exploit labor. It's like literally in order to not hire the appropriate number of union people and to save money that way, they will force their church members to do hard, grueling manual labor in order to, which is actually more costly in labor terms.
Yeah.
Right? Because a 7-year-old kid is not going to be able to do things right that they need to do to make things safe and work. But they're totally willing to do that in order to, just get what they want.
Yeah.
Which is to maintain the social relations. So
Right.
Mormon Church is great, and since I'm at the top of it, I'm the greatest.
I guess it's one question I was
Mhm.
thinking about this whole time. Fundamentally, wouldn't all churches, in one retrospect, in their very core nature, be kind of socialist?
Yeah, I was just going through my mind like all the things I can think. I mean, Christianity, obviously there's the community of believers, and bloodline doesn't determine who's saved and who isn't, just your relationship to God or whatever. Islam is pretty similar to that. I don't really know much about other religions, but yeah, there's been socialist traditions from I think every single religion that you could point at, and people who use their faith to come to a socialist kind of statement. But yeah, as far as like all religions being inherently socialist, I can't think of like a counterexample why that wouldn't be true, but I'm not sure what it is about each religion.
Slavery in the South, right? What was used as a prop for that? Well,
Right.
Religion.
Yeah.
The murder of the Ute, Paiute, Ghost Ute. What was used as a justification for that? Religion. I mean, right, the Catholic Church, the same Catholic Church that declares crusades and, murders thousands of people in Byzantium, is also the Catholic Church that arms the workers in Nicaragua in the 80s to fight against the bosses and the landlords. So, at least for my view, I don't think there's anything inherently socialist or capitalist necessarily. Scientology may be excluded.
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't. That's what I was thinking of. Scientology. Scientology's out.
Actually, I would say the one counterexample to that is Hinduism. Except for its like very basic origins, it has an entire caste system of exploitation built into it. In fact, the whole idea of reincarnation never even became popular in that religion until they started to build like villages and cities and stuff like that, where you could have exploited people. That means it's like, oh well, you just need to be a good version of yourself, and then later on you could be reincarnated and all this. So not even all of them are equal in this sort of like tit for tat.
Right. And then where's one of the largest communist movements in the world, though? Like India. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how many of them are Hindu, but
A lot of them.
probably, yeah. We good?
All right.
Okay. Thank you.